Marshall because of all the generals I've ever heard of in the American Army, he is the one that is spoken of with unquestioning admiration. In the foreword of the book, the author says he did his job in the most difficult times, never lied to anyone, including politicians who constantly would lie to him. His name is synonymous with cool, unemotional professionalism. And what's impressed me when I first started studying him, in the time in the Army, starting in the early 1900s, which was totally dominated by West Pointers, he won the unqualified admiration of not only General Pershing, but General Eisenhower, General Bradley, General Mark Clark, and the obedience of Douglas MacArthur and the unquestioning obedience of George Patton. He had every job there was to have in the United States Army, including Chiefs of Staff. The one thing he was unable to do was command troops in warfare, even though he was a staff officer during World War II. After that, he became Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and in 1953 won the Nobel Peace Prize. I can't think of any other career that comes anywhere close. George Catlett Marshall was born in 1880 in Unionville, Pennsylvania. His father was kind of distant and favored his much older brother, who was 6 years older, by the name of Stuart. He also had a sister who was named Marie, and she was 4 years older. However, he was his mother's favorite. And he was kind of a dissolute student, so much so that when his father tried to get him admitted to a private elementary school, he was seen to be a slow learner in the vernacular of the time. And he continued to be all the way through high school. His older brother went, I don't know why, but there was no family connection, but he went to VMI and did well. While he was there, the older brother dated or tried to woo a young woman who was known as Lily, who lived on the edge of the campus there in Lexington. Anyway, Stuart graduated, did not go in the military, and became a chemist at a steel foundry somewhere in Pennsylvania. Now, I'm going to tell you several anecdotes that seem to give the most revealing side of General Marshall's character. When he was a boy, he was unable to have a dog. However, one of his good friends had a dog, and he slowly wooed the dog away from his friend, unbeknownst to him. So much so that the dog would follow George rather than his friend. The dog's name was Trip. After he went off to VMI, he came back years later to find the dog still alive, but it's almost blind. He didn't recognize him. And when he came closer, the dog, after sniffing for a few minutes, finally caught scent of him and then went crazy. And that was the most flattering thing that occurred to me on that short visit home after many years of not being there. And so that's one of the things you see about General Marshall. He values loyalty above everything. And once he thought highly of you, he would just never not give up that opinion. Finally did go to VMI. He went there after having typhoid fever, and he showed up a week late. And being a Citadel graduate, I would not want to go to either Citadel or VMI a week late. And during that time, there was a particularly stupid hazing routine they would do. They would put a razor-sharp bayonet in the floor and make a brand new rat, they called him, a new plebe, squat over it naked for 10 minutes. Well, they didn't know he'd had typhoid fever, and after 2 minutes, he collapsed on top of the bayonet. He came very near to having a bad wound, although he was taken to the medical officer who cleaned up the wound and sewed it up. Of course, the upperclassmen were terrified he was going to rat on them. He never did. And after that, he seemingly won his spurs, so much so by the end of his first year, he was named first corporal of the Corps. By the time he was a senior, he was first captain of the Corps. During this time, he started dating the Elizabeth Coles Carter, otherwise known as Lily. He finally got her to agree to marry him, which horrified his older brother. He couldn't believe his younger brother was going to outshine him in one thing or another. They were married on February 11th, 1902 at the Carter home in Lexington. They went on their wedding night down to Washington, D.C., and it was on that night, and this is what the author makes a big deal about. She revealed to him that she had a weak heart, a mitral insufficiency, which meant the doctor said she could never chance having children. And in the days before birth control, we all know what that meant. And after a few years, people started commenting, why are the marshals waiting so long to have children? He never commented, but he never wavered in his devotion to his wife. His older brother, Stuart, married after he did and had a son who he started to crow and to brag about. And finally it was revealed to the older brother that the medical reason why they could not have children, and to his delight, he would goad George by asking, how's the bell of WWII? Has she answered the call of duty yet? Well, consequently, General Marshall barred his older brother from his home for the rest of his life, never spoke to him. On April 12, 1902, he left by the troop ship Kilpatrick for 2 years or to duty in the Philippines. His company commander was a captain, later General Walter Kruger, who was one of the first officers to be astounded by his cool and serious demeanor. His troops tried to try him when they were crossing a stream, and they yelled crocodile, which there were in the stream, and he ran out the other side, and then they all laughed at him. So he took sides of the matter, called them attention, called them in single file, and marched them 4 times back across the stream. They never challenged him again. While he was there, he became friends with the medical officer, and there was medical officers who were trying to help some of the villagers nearby who had a epidemic of dysentery. Unfortunately, the medical officer caught it too. But Lieutenant Marshall was so exhausted when the medical officer confessed to him he was probably going to die that Marshall went to sleep. The medical officer didn't die, but he always stated, there was that guy who went to sleep when I was trying to tell him I was going to die. During this time, he started dating the Elizabeth Coles Carter, otherwise known as Lily. He finally got her to agree to marry him, which horrified his older brother. He couldn't believe his younger brother was going to outshine him in one thing or another. They were married on February 11th, 1902 at the Carter home in Lexington. They went on their wedding night down to Washington, D.C., and it was on that night, and this is what the author makes a big deal about, she revealed to him that she had a weak heart, a mitral insufficiency, which meant the doctor said she could never chance having children. And in the days before birth control, we all know what that meant. And after a few years, people started commenting, why are the marshals waiting so long to have children? He never commented, but he never wavered in his devotion to his wife. His older brother, Stuart, married after he did and had a son who he started to crow and to brag about. And finally it was revealed to the older brother that the medical reason why they could not have children, and to his delight, he would goad George by asking, how's the bell of WWII? Has she answered the call of duty yet? Well, consequently, General Marshall barred his older brother from his home for the rest of his life, never spoke to him. On April 12, 1902, he left by the troop ship Kilpatrick for 2 years or to duty in the Philippines. His company commander was a captain, later General Walter Kruger, who was one of the first officers to be astounded by his cool and serious demeanor. His troops tried to try him when they were crossing a stream, and they yelled crocodile, which there were in the stream, and he ran out the other side, and then they all laughed at him. So he took sides of the matter, called them attention, called them in single file, and marched them 4 times back across the stream. They never challenged him again. While he was there, he became friends with the medical officer, and there was medical officers who were trying to help some of the villagers nearby who had a epidemic of dysentery. Unfortunately, the medical officer caught it too. But Lieutenant Marshall was so exhausted when the medical officer confessed to him he was probably going to die that Marshall went to sleep. The medical officer didn't die, but he always stated, there was that guy who went to sleep when I was trying to tell him I was going to die. And was informed by his mother-in-law that she still could not travel with him out to Fort Reno out in Oklahoma. Not only that, she also informed that she was going to now have to start living off his income. And he said he never kept so many meticulous notes on accounts, because one dress the ladies would buy would be $14. I don't know what that would be in modern currency, but they had to put a huge strain on a lieutenant's pay. During this time, he was temporarily transferred to the 1st Cavalry at Fort Clark, Texas. And he was given the job of mapping a large area of southwest Texas. To do this, he was given a sergeant, a cavalry sergeant, a driver, a packer and his assistant, a cook, 2 horses, an escort wagon, a 4-line mule train, and 20 pack mules. And what they were supposed to do was go along the rail line, counting the difference between all the rails, and that would give them a base distance of how they were going. It took 6 weeks to get out to Langtree, Texas, at which time the mule skinner, who was in his 60s, and Lieutenant Marshall, the last 3 days had no water at all. When they got to Langtree, the sergeant stripped down to his underwear and he's 45 and got into the local whorehouse and locked himself in. They called Lieutenant Marshall out, who marched over there, kicked the door down, got the sergeant up, made him turn some of the women loose, and never gave any indication he had any temptation to stay. When he finally came back, his uniform was in tatters, he was burned black. His captain said he was too ashamed to look at him, but the engineer who looked over the map said that was the only complete survey they had of anybody who was set out there. And he was able to scrape together enough money to take Lily for 4 months through Europe, at which time he was able to watch the English army on Salisbury Plain on maneuvers. And even though he was not officially allowed to make a report, he did so anyway, and it's in the National Archive. It's better than the one that the military attaché gave. Now still a lieutenant, and his commanding officer, Johnson Haygood, wrote in his official report of Marshall should be made a brigadier general in the regular army, and every day this promotion is delayed as a loss to the army and the nation. So finally, when World War I was declared between the United States and Germany, he was a captain and he was Chief of Staff for General Siebert of the 1st Infantry Division. And as a staff officer, one would think he didn't have much combat time, but actually his job was to go forward to be a liaison between the headquarters and all the regiments who were up in the line. And he was under fire quite a bit, including getting gassed. He actually had a horse shot out from underneath him. It was during this time that Pershing was having to fight with the French and the British, and everybody wanted to break up American troops, but he insisted he wanted them all together under American command, and he came by the 1st Division almost unannounced, and the commanding general and his main chief staff were gone, and Marshall put together a demonstration on a new way to breach trenches, which neither the commanding general or the chief of staff had seen before. When Pershing asked him for an after-action report, the general flubbed it, and then the chief of staff flubbed it. And Pershing was very angry and cursed the commanding general in front of all his junior officers. And this made Marshall mad. And he went up to Pershing, knowing probably this was going to be the end of his career, and Pershing said, "You must appreciate the troubles we have." To which Marshall replied, "Yes, General, but we have them every day, and they need to be solved by night." After Pershing grunted and got into his car and left, General Siebert came up, shook his hand, and thanked him for his uprightness, but both he and Marshall figured his career was over with. He stayed with the division for one more battle. In March 28, 1918, he was staff officer with the division when they went to Catigny, and his horse fell and fractured his ankle, and he kept on that even though he was in pain, and he didn't complain. He never left the line. In the after-action report, the commanding general recommended a promotion for Marshall, but instead Pershing brought him straight up to his headquarters where he stayed for the rest of the war. Now, I was watching some video of, I think, Pershing, and there is video of Pershing and Marshall and several other officers standing at the bow of a ship. And by all accounts, Pershing was a stoic man, but he is laughing and giggling with Marshall on the front of the bow of this ship. And Marshall became his aide, trusted aide, for the next 5 years. So that shows how much Pershing relied on him. at this time that was the beginning of a lifelong career problem he had with Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was the Chief of Staff of the 42nd Infantry Division, known as the Rainbow Division. And in fact, he was really just the commanding general, because the commanding general was insecure and always deferred to MacArthur. It was during the end of the war, right at the very end, and the Germans were all retreating, and the Americans were keeping up with the Germans far better than the French. And what they were doing was bounding through one another, and this is very difficult. When I was a young lieutenant, they said, whatever you do, if there is a boundary between divisions or regiments or whatever, you do not cross that. Well, what they were doing, they were in the southern part of France, and they were heading toward the town of Sedan, which is the famous town where the Germans came through not twice, but really 3 times to conquer France. And everybody wanted the honor of reconquering Sedan. Well, unfortunately, the French lagged behind. And so MacArthur was angling to get it. The 1st Infantry Division, of which Marshall had been a part, so was moving up on it. And so they had to issue this order, and this is verbatim for the order. It was issued: General Pershing desires that the honor of entering Sedan should fall to the 1st American Army. He has every confidence that the troops of the 1st Corps, assisted on the right by the 5th Corps, will enable him to realize this desire. In transmitting the foregoing message, your attention is invited to the favorable opportunity now existing for pressing our advantage through the night. Marshall's immediate superior, General Drum, ordered Marshall to add the sentence, and this is the cause of all the problem: boundaries will not be considered binding. Well, what happened, of course, you can imagine. Every prima donna commander in the whole place started heading pell-mell down the nearest road they could find towards Sedan. In the confusion, General Paul Summerall, who became president of the Citadel, commanding the 5th Corps, ordered the 1st Infantry Division down the road. In all the confusion, here comes the 42nd Infantry Division. Douglas MacArthur, who is not dressed in proper uniform, is arrested by a 1st Infantry Division lieutenant as a German spy, and is volcanically angry, and he forever blamed Marshall for that order, and he thought it was some kind of conspiracy against him to keep him from able to have the honor of reconquering Sedan. In the end, no one conquered it. The Germans held that until after the armistice. Colonel, and he was Pershing's immediate assistant, and he was allowed to follow Pershing, right behind Pershing, as they marched through the Arc de Triomphe and down the Champs-Élysées. It was the first time foreign troops were allowed to do that since 1870, and he did the same thing through London. And this is where some of the rumors came he might not be so enamored with his wife Lily. He managed to stay there another 2 years. And while this time he was known for staying out late and dancing with all the duchesses and aristocrats both in France and in England. But he did come home, and he was happy to see his wife, but he was also not happy to be reduced in grade back to a regular Army major. Finally, he was transferred to Fort Myer. General Pershing retired, and while he was there, he brought his wife to live with him. And while there, they met a neighbor's daughter who was 2, who became effectively adopted daughter, and they maintained a lifelong relationship. He was unable to father any children of his own. And the girl's account of him as a parent was he was always patient, never ill with him, and she also gave accounts of how he was with his wife. He always doted on her and never was angry with her, and she never tried to take advantage of him, and that was the good thing too. China with the 15th Infantry and cleaned up that unit, so much so that when the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek forces were in a revolutionary, they were retreating through the town they were through, and by pure bluff, he stationed all his troops all outside and kept the city from being ransacked by both communist or nationalist troops. And the locals were so happy with him, they gave a plaque which stayed there until 1938 when the unit was transferred to Fort Benning. His wife, ironically, went with him to China because she had 10 servants. She didn't have to do a thing. And there are pictures of them happily sunbathing out together, which I find amazing. But after that command, he came back and was hoping to be sent to the infantry school at Fort Benning, but he was actually transferred to the Army War College, which was good, but not what he wanted. Unfortunately, while he was there, his wife died on September 16, 1927. At that time, any doubts about his true affections toward his wife were answered. He became almost catatonically depressed. He lost so much weight, his sister had to move in with him. And it was while they were there, he finished out the year teaching, but when he was offered the assistant commandant and the teaching position at the infantry school. It was during this time he started keeping a little black book of all the promising officers, and in that book went the names of Eisenhower, Bradley, all the ones we mentioned before. In December 1929, he met an attractive widow by the name of Catherine Brown, who was become his second wife, and she had 3 children from her husband, 2 boys and a girl. And General Marshall was so good at being charming, he won the children over as well. These were children already in their 20s. After MacArthur retired in the middle to late 30s, finally Marshall was summoned to the White House, and it's recorded that President Roosevelt said, "General Marshall, I have in my mind to choose as the next Chief of Staff of the United States Army. What do you think about that?" To which Marshall replied, "Nothing, Mr. President, except to remind you that I have a habit of saying exactly what I think. And that, as you know, can be often unpleasing. Is that all right?" Roosevelt grinned, "Yes." "Mr. President, you said yes pleasantly, but I have to remind you again, it may be unpleasant." Roosevelt replied, "I know." And Marshall left, not knowing if he'd blown the job interview or changed the president's mind, but evidently he changed the guy's mind. And I know from hearing other accounts, he always called all the generals and admirals by their first name except for General Marshall. General Marshall purposely maintained a distance and would never have dinner or drinks with the president because he wanted to maintain that command distance so he would be able to say the difficult things that had to be said. Now I have to speak about the political situation at the time. At the time when they were thinking about war, everyone was thinking of war with Japan, and they were worried about a European war, but especially the Navy, was concerned about the Japanese threat. And what we know now was completely different. What both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy thought of each other as the prime adversary. But they thought their battle would be under the United States Navy was Plan Yellow, in which they would sally forth from either Pearl Harbor or the Philippines and have a meeting engagement and one decisive battle with the Japanese out somewhere in the Western Pacific. And the Japanese thought this as well. So when it came time to start warning forces, they warned them in the Philippines and Guam. They didn't think they would come all the way out to Pearl Harbor. It was such a large way. And President Roosevelt had moved the fleet from its home base in San Diego up to Pearl Harbor. Now, this author Mosley states that not only Admiral Kimmel and General Short acted badly and acted almost incompetently during Pearl Harbor, but also Marshall and the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, did as well. Everybody knew they'd broken the Japanese code, diplomatic code, and they were reading the thing almost in real time, and they knew there were 13 parts coming through. They were waiting for the 14th. General Marshall had been off to North Carolina to watch these huge training maneuvers, which was part of his job. He came back on Saturday. On Sunday, the signals officer realized there was a message coming through after which they were supposed to destroy their signal operation and get out of Washington, D.C. Well, he knew what that meant. So he frantically called for General Marshall, who insisted on finishing his horseback ride and taking a shower. He got hold of Admiral Stark a little bit faster. But when they read the message, they correctly interpreted what this would mean. But General Marshall was stickler for Army signals. He insisted on sending it to the Army Signal Corps. But what no one would tell him was the Signal Corps was down for some atmospheric reason. They couldn't raise Hawaii. Admiral Stark tried to tell him to use the Navy signal, but he stuck by them. So they had 4 hours notice, and by the time it got down to it and realized they couldn't get the message through military channels, and they sent it through Western Union, They had 30 minutes, and by the time the message was sent by courier, the attack was already going off. In the political aftermath, the Navy caught the worst of it, and Admiral Stark was fired, and they brought in Admiral Ernest J. King, who was, I've never seen anything about him that said he was a nice person. They said he was a brilliant sailor, a brilliant commander, but he was really a huge stickler. And evidently, he had sworn off hard liquor for the duration of the war, but he didn't swear off women. And evidently, he liked to pinch Navy wives. There was none of that with Marshall. When King took over, he took the unusual step of walking over to General Marshall's office unannounced. General Marshall, unfortunately, had a representative of the Australian Prime Minister who was yelling at him because he wanted to send troops to help, protect Australia. And everybody who worked for General Marshall, including his civilian secretaries, were terrified of the man, and he always professed confusion at that because he thought of himself as a friendly uncle. But he was known to even have normally cool-headed young officers turn them into stammering idiots. When he focused, they always said he had piercing blue eyes, and he would send them, and one guy, supposedly, it turns out to be untrue, was so frightened he had a heart attack and died, but it was believed at the time in the Pentagon. So here comes the Chief of Naval Operations, and she knows he's got this really difficult, and she's afraid to interrupt. So King waits for about 30 minutes, finally gets mad and walks off and goes back to his office. Marshall, when he found out, immediately grabbed his cap and went back over. And fortunately, the two men worked well together. He was also saddled with having to deal with the politicians, and he was a stickler for doing his work and being in bed by 10 p.m. He was unprepared for Churchill, who liked to keep up the president till 2 o'clock in the morning drinking, which Marshall wasn't fond of anyway. But he did form a good relationship with Sir John Dill, who was on the Imperial staff. And after a bunch of disasters, he had been fired by Churchill but sent his liaison to the United States. And they formed a very close relationship and was probably the only confidant Marshall had during World War II. Unfortunately, he may have betrayed that confidence because Marshall, once Germany formed the war, started forming plans for invading cross-channel as soon as possible. Originally, as early as 1942, and then again in 1943. He did not want to tell the British this because he knew they would try to shoot it down, which somebody leaked the plan to them. And when Churchill came over, they had a complete set of reasons why they shouldn't do it, and Roosevelt overruled Marshall, but it never broke. His final disappointment as commander-in-chief was in December 1943. Roosevelt told him, "George, you're not going to command the cross-channel invasion. I need you here." And that's what he thought of General Marshall.